What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Scouting Fins right here on the Threads Per Carry podcast feed, also part of the 5 Reasons Sports Network. If you guys have not already, go ahead and sign up on discord.gg/onlyfins. If you're not part of OnlyFins, you're missing news that CK, Simon, Alf, myself, and Coach are putting out there where we don't put out on our actual socials. Go ahead and make sure you join on a desktop or your Apple MacBook. Don't do it on your iPhone. Apple is going to upcharge you by an extra $1. $2.99 to read only and $4.99 for all access a month, where you also get information from Locked On Dolphins, Kyle's Crab. So what are you waiting for? Go ahead and join OnlyFins on Discord. Coach, final episode of our prospect review series. We're talking about 4 guys today.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like we're closing out a lot of things today. Today was the last day of school for my daughter moving into high school. We saw 12 out of the 13 picks now signed by the Dolphins, and the 13th should be pretty soon here. And like you said, we're finishing up our review series for the 2026 Miami Dolphins draft picks, and still got some really good names to talk about here.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to be talking about Kevin Coleman Jr., Seydou Traore, DJ Campbell, and Max Llewellyn. So let's go ahead and get right into it, guys. Kevin Coleman Jr., pick number 177 in the 5th round, born in St. Louis, Missouri, went to Missouri as well, finished off his school year, his senior year there. And 4 schools in 5 years, Coach. Jackson State, Louisville, Mississippi State, Missouri. Really only dropped 7 catches in his career. Okay, 5.7 yards after the catch per reception, forced 18 missed tackles as a receiver. He just wasn't a slot guy. He worked out of the backfield as well. Almost 600 career punt return yards, return touchdown, 12.6 yards per reception in 2025. He has that special teams value for the Dolphins. As a punt returner, kick returner as well. Seydou Traore was also his teammate in 2024 at Mississippi State, and they were just drafted 3 picks apart.
Yeah, Kevin Coleman is a really interesting one. I did a deep dive on him a few days ago, and I don't know that he stands out quite in the ways that you would think. Like, I think that a lot of people compare him to Malik Washington because they're kind of similar in terms of stature and in some ways the way that they were used. But I feel like Malik Washington is a little more of a physical player, whereas Kevin Coleman has a little bit more quickness to him. Like you said, they used him in the backfield, very much a gadget type player. Didn't see him lined up on the perimeter a whole lot, so he didn't face a lot of press coverage. We don't know what that package really looks like for him. As a receiver, was almost exclusively used in the slot, but they also, they were running jets to him. They were lining him up as a wildcat quarterback. Like you said, they used him as a punt returner there as well. So a lot of versatility there, but on the flip side of it, you talked about him, the 5 different schools. And on one hand, you don't like to see that, but on the other hand, I think we're going to see more of that with the NIL, the transfer portal, in the way that guys can hop around the country in terms of doing that. But the other side of that is that he never really got a chance to develop in one place. It was kind of like, hey, here's a package of plays for you. Go, be elusive, make something happen. Whereas I think that, we've heard John Eric Sullivan talk about wanting to draft guys whose best football is ahead of them. And when you look at how Coleman has bounced around the NCAA, I think there's still a lot of room for him to develop, a lot of room for him to grow as a receiver. And it's going to be interesting to see how he develops, especially as we get into year 2, 3, and see how he's able to, stack from year 1 to year 2 and see that improvement from him.
And, he's been productive wherever he's been, right? Mississippi State, that was his breakout season, 74 catches for 932 yards, 6 touchdowns, 3rd team All-SEC. 66 receptions at Missouri, 732 yards, a touchdown. His production dipped a little bit due to scheme and personal factors that were outside of his control. But he's not a primary wide receiver guy. Like, he's not your X type of wide receiver. He's your pure slot guy, 5'10", just under 180 pounds, right? He can run those Z routes, as that Z wide receiver. He can run those sharp routes. He's able to, dip his hips a little bit, disguise his intention, how he's going to be manipulating leverage, so that way he can create separation at the top of the stem. And, with his 4.49 40 speed, he's able to keep that speed as he goes throughout his route tree, right? It also allows him to separate late where corners are trying to catch up to him, and then one last burst at the end where he's able to get out of his break and make that catch. He understands zone pretty well. Against man, you're able to get his hands on him, you're able to press against him, but again, more so you'd prefer to play man up against him, but up against Bobby Slowick's offense, defenses are more so going to be playing zone coverage.
Yeah, and like you said, I think that, when he can work in space, he's a lot more effective. He is very good at eluding tackles. He is not very good at breaking tackles, right? He's not very strong, but he can be slippery. He can be, tough to tackle in a phone booth, that type of thing. You talked about the production a little bit there. I think that was CK pointed out that over all 4 years where he was playing, that his yards per catch dropped every year. So that's a little bit concerning. You kind of have to dig a little deeper. And, like you said, the breakout season was 2024 at Mississippi State, and then he goes to Missouri in 2025. But one of the things that you got to keep in mind there, right, it dropped from 74 receptions to 66, dropped from 932 to 732 in terms of yards. But they were also missing their starting quarterback there at Missouri in Bo Perbula for 3 of those games, right? So if you get the starting quarterback out there for another 3 games, then you have 3 more games of production. Maybe, you get an extra one in terms of bowl games, stuff like that. So like you said, right, personnel factored into it as well in terms of why that production dropped.
Yeah, and then you also have to think about as well is that 4 different starting quarterbacks he's played with. And you bring up the point that, when your starting quarterback is out for 3-4 games, I mean, we saw with Tua, Jalen Waddle's production dipped whenever Tua was not in the game. Tyreek Hill just a little bit too whenever Tua was not in the game as well. So when you have your starting quarterback, you get that chemistry, you're able to produce a little bit more. Now, when we talk about with Malik Willis and Bobby Slowick's system, that play action, that wide zone scheme opens up underneath, drag routes, curl routes, those crossers. And with Kevin Coleman Jr.'s precise positioning and the way he's able to run those routes, just at the short area part of the field, he's able to position himself really well up against zone coverage, and that's an ideal match. Now, do I think he's going to, push Malik Washington or maybe even Caleb Douglas for that wide receiver 3 role? We'll see when it comes to camp, but he's a 5th-round pick. Malik Washington was a starter last season. Caleb Douglas was a 3rd-round pick as well. And then you also have Chris Bell, who was also drafted in the 3rd round. So he's got a lot of competition that he needs to work up against. And I think you agree with me. Like, his best bet to make the roster is in special teams, the punt return game, the kick return game, being a gunner, eluding those tackles or maybe even making those tackles on special teams.
Yeah, and I think that that's going to be a big thing for him. When you talk about the players that he's really going to be competing for snaps with, right? You're looking at the Malik Washingtons, you're looking at the Tutu Atwells, even the Taj Washingtons in there, right? Those are the type of players that are going to operate out of the slot, can do some of the same things that Kevin Coleman can do as well. So I think that special teams is going to be where he's going to need to make his mark, because I think he is somewhat limited in terms of where you can align him specifically as a wide receiver, right? You can do some other things in terms of out of the backfield, running jets, running wildcat, that type of stuff. But when you line him up as a true wide receiver, I think you're a little bit limited in terms of the alignments that you can put him in. So, I don't see him beating out of Malik Washington, right? Health, related would be the only issue there. So I think that, it would have to be a scenario where the Dolphins decide that, for example, Malik Washington is too valuable to use as a punt returner, but then you have a guy like Kevin Coleman who is similar in that regard, maybe even a little more of a big play guy than what Malik Washington is, and that Kevin Coleman can develop into a primary punt returner that can also spell Malik Washington. Like I think that's the best fit for him. And then, like you were saying, if he can expand that special teams role where he can contribute on some of the coverage teams as well in terms of tackling, like that's going to be his best path to making his roster and really solidifying himself on there.
Yeah. All right. 3 picks later, Seydou Traore was picked, 180th pick out of Mississippi State. Born in France to parents of Algerian and Ivorian descent, grew up in London, played soccer as a goalkeeper, attended the NFL Academy in London, right? At Mississippi State from 2024 to 2025, 69 catches, 730 yards, 6 touchdowns, started in 2024 and 2025. He was a reliable SEC tight end, 48 games, over 130 catches, almost 1.5K yards, and 10 touchdowns in his career, over 2,000 snaps as a tight end. 6'4", 244. And coach, this feels like another F position type of player to me. He can catch. He's not the best blocker out there, but, at least average to maybe, serviceable as a lead blocker when his athletic profile is more so of a receiving type of tight end.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about the athletic profile, right? 6'4", 244, has that 40-inch vertical leap, which is in the 99th percentile for tight ends. Also the 10.7 broad jump, which is 98th percentile for tight ends. And I think that shows up on film for him, right? You can see, like you said, very much an F-type player, right? Move, catch. His run after catch really surprised me. Like, he's very physical with the ball in his hands, not necessarily an elusive type guy, but he will fall forward. He will fight for extra yards, but there is a lot of room to develop as that inline blocker. I'm not sure that he's ever going to be, right? He's never going to take snaps from Will Kacmarek, for example. But when you look at the fact that, like you said, right, international pathway player here, still relatively new to the game, he's got a lot of untapped potential there that you can get into when you look at the effort, when you look at the physicality, right? There's a lot of reasons to think that there is still more meat on the bone for him to develop as a blocker from where he is. And that international pathway player thing is kind of important there too, because right now with the 90-man roster, you get an exception for that. So he's essentially a free roster spot right now. I believe that he is the first international pathway player to be drafted, which kind of shows how much the Dolphins thought of him. And if he doesn't make the 53 and clears waivers, then there's essentially a free spot on the practice squad for him as well, which I don't know whether or not that's the long-term vision for him, because when you draft a guy in the 5th round, that's typically a guy that's going to likely make the 53, right? I would be, if they are continue to be high on him through camp, for example, then I would be a little hesitant to think that you could cut him and sneak him through waivers and put him on a practice squad, right? Because you go back to the Elijah Higgins thing, right? They tried to do that with him as a 6th round pick and sneak him through, ended up going to the Cardinals on waivers. So it's going to be interesting to see where Traore fits with that 53-man roster, or even through preseason, right? This could be a player that maybe shows out in training camp and they kind of decide to essentially not target him, right? Try to make it a redshirt year, try to hide him, and then slip him through waivers and bring him back on practice squad as that international pathway player. But yeah, I mean, definitely a player that is super athletic, still a lot of upside, and going to be interesting to see how he performs against NFL talent.
Yeah, just that limited football experience, 6 years total, 4 in college, doesn't necessarily have the developed football instincts against players who have been doing this in high school, throughout college as well, camps, sometimes even middle school as well. And his run blocking definitely needs some improvement, even though we said it's average. His profile is as an F tight end, but he's not a traditional Y tight end, right? And you said it, he's not going to take snaps from Will Kacmarek. And Traore does not need to be a blocker to contribute immediately, right? Special teams, obviously, the calling card of the game. And the thing with him is if for example, right, we're hearing out of camp that Malik Willis was not able to move the offense very early on, early last week, and now the offense has gotten a little bit better. Well, what's going to happen, come week 1, week 2, Traore's on the field and Malik Willis is trying to look for him, and the play is already broken down and he doesn't know where to go compared to a Will Kastner, Greg Dulcich. Maybe if Kevin Coleman Jr. is on the field or a guy like Caleb Douglas, they'll know where to go. They'll know how to handle the scramble drill. Traore, he's still learning. And you said, with his athletic profile, the ceiling can be up there, but there's some uncertainty for Traore for this exact same reason, right? He's got to develop his blocking, number one, to get onto the field as that second, maybe third tight end. If Dulcich is tired, Traore can come in and sub him for, maybe 5-6 snaps a game, make an impact blocking, or if Devon Achane is going to the wide, he can get to the second level, make that clean block for him, or, just moves the chain on a critical, 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3, as, that pass catcher, no one's really looking at him. He's going to have to make his snaps count. He's going to have to make training camp count too.
Yeah, I very much think that training camp is going to be a big deal for him. And I think that, we talked about Kevin Coleman's ideal role to be able to have that path to 53 for Traore. We've talked a couple times on here about the increase of 12 and 13 personnel across the NFL. And Traore is, probably the ideal type of third tight end that you have on the roster, right? You're going to have Kasmerik's going to be your wide, Dulcich is going to be your primary F, and you're probably going to have somebody else, whether it's Ben Sims, somebody like that, that's going to be kind of your hybrid Y, also your fullback type role. But you're going to need somebody to back up Dulcich, and Traore could really fit in there to where, again, right, special teams is going to be massive for him because you can't have a third tight end that's not a contributor on special teams.
Yeah.
But if he can prove himself to be valuable in that role, then you can have him, basically shadowing Dulcich, right? Learning from Dulcich. You go into those 3 tight end sets, you give him, I don't know, maybe 3 to 5 snaps a game, right? And you kind of let him dip his toes in there and get wet so that, when you get to 2027, Dulcich is on a 1-year deal, right? If Dulcich is just average in 2027 and Traore makes a jump, right, then maybe that's where you organically can move on from Greg Dulcich, that type of thing. So that's, kind of where I see it. And then I think that he's going to be an effective receiver essentially from day one. Like I knew about the soccer background. I did not know about the goalkeeper background, which is interesting because if you think about the way that goalkeepers play,
Yep.
and they have to, we talk about catch radius with pass catchers all the time, right? Right. Yeah. You're laying out sideways, up, down, right? Going to the corner, right? So that translates pretty well, I would think. So I think that he's going to be an effective receiver from the very beginning, and then where his blocking ends up is kind of going to determine where that ceiling lands for him.
Yeah, you think about it in that 13 personnel, maybe potentially some snaps in preseason where he's in 21, 22 personnel, aligned as, that flex tight end in the slot, 2 high zone as a defense. He runs that seam, and he ran those seam routes really well at Mississippi State. With his goalkeeper instincts, right? If the ball is thrown, 18, 20 yards down the field, he's able to track it over his outside shoulder, right? With his goalkeeper instincts, he can adjust his body sideways, extend his arms fully, just plucking the ball out of the air with his fingertips and, just absorbing the contact from the safety on the catch too, right? He can hold on to that. He can potentially, bounce off of defenders as well next to 2-3 yards after the catch, before being brought down. And that's the kind of tight end and receiving tight end that the Dolphins have lacked in years. Think of like Mike Gesicki, but he was 6'6", didn't necessarily have the yards after the catch, but he's able to pluck the ball out of the air. Think of him as a mini Gesicki in that way. That's the way I see it as his ceiling.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? I don't think that he's, again, right, we're going through the different F tight ends that we've had through the years. I think that he is better after the catch than what Gesicki is. Maybe not quite the radius there. You compare him to a Jonnu Smith. Not sure that he's quite the shifty after catch guy that Jonnu is, but probably just as physical. So I think that when the F tight end, those receiving type tight ends are kind of essentially their own position in today's NFL, but you do have that range of the Gesicki with the wide catch radius and poor run after the catch versus a Jonnu Smith who, might not have the same catch radius but is better after the catch. I think Traore is somewhere comfortably in the middle of those two when we, try to come up with a comparison for him.
Yeah. All right. With that, we will head to break. There's a thief in these finals, somebody who's been quietly locking up all series long. You've got a hunch on who it is. Underdog's got $1 million for whoever calls it right. That's right. $1 million is sitting in a pot, and all you have to do is pick the player who walks away with the most steals in the series. Your picks don't even need to win. Just back the right thief, because you can make picks and win money right now. The pot is waiting. Get your picks right, and you could win up to 5,000 times your cash. And with Steal the Pot, even your losing picks can pay out. I'm going ahead and taking Victor Wembanyama in Game 2 to have higher than 3 blocks up against the New York Knicks this Friday night. Go ahead and make sure you download Underdog Fantasy on the App Store today. So once again, download the app today and use promo code 3yards to score $50 in bonus entries when you play your first $5. That's promo code 3yards. Underdog, make picks and win money.
18 plus, 19 plus in Alabama and Nebraska, 19 plus in Colorado for some games, 21 plus in Arizona, Massachusetts, and Virginia, and present in a state where Underdog Fantasy operates. Terms apply. See assets.underdogfantasy.com/web/play and get terms _DFS_.html for details. Offer not valid in Maryland, Michigan, New Jersey, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Concerned with your play? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit ncpgambling.org. In New York, call the 24/7 HOPE line at 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369.
All right, and we are back. All right, Coach, we talked about Seydou Traore, and we also talked about Kevin Coleman Jr. Both of those guys were teammates at Mississippi State in 2024. Now they're teammates again with the Miami Dolphins in 2026. All right, on to the final 2 remaining players in this Miami Dolphins draft class, which featured 4 Texas Longhorns being drafted, along with 2 Texas Tech teammates. So they had 6 players from the state of Texas drafted here, 6 out of 13. And one could denote they could be eyeing maybe more Texas players or Texas Tech players in the 2027 NFL draft. But let's go ahead and talk about DJ Campbell. He was acquired via trade with the Carolina Panthers, right? Born in Arlington, Texas, Bowie High School, and he didn't actually want to play football initially. He was a defensive tackle all throughout youth football into high school. His head coach switched him to the offensive line. He was selected for the 2022 Under Armour All-America game, was ranked number 14 overall by ESPN, top 10 overall nationally, recruits from Alabama, Georgia, LSU, Florida State, and he chose Texas. And he was a starter his sophomore year and never lost the job. 43 consecutive starts at right guard, Coach.
Yeah, and this is a player I've kind of watched for a while. I've always been a fan of, the offense that Texas runs was Steve Sarkisian. Kyle Flood is one of my favorite offensive coordinators to listen to anytime he's talking. Right, you go back to 2024. I was really high on Chris Jones, who ended up going to the Cardinals. Last year was very high on Kelvin Banks. So I've watched this offensive line for a while. I've seen DJ Campbell playing for a while, and he's one of those guys that never really stood out, but was also never a liability either. We talk about the measurables, right? He's 6'3", 313, has some abnormally long arms for a guard, right? At 34 and a quarter inches is more than a full inch above the league average of 33.08. And then his wingspan is about 3 inches wider. So, a guy that really covers a lot of space, even though he's not that, he's not Patrick Paul, Caden Proctor, that 6'7" monster, right? But he can still cover a lot of space with his wingspan and the way that he can get there. I think that when we look at DJ Campbell, I think one of the legs up that he has on some of the other young offensive linemen that we've had, again, playing in that Texas offense. When we look at guys like Jonah Savaianaya, Caden Proctor playing for Arizona and Alabama respectively, those teams really didn't run a lot of outside zone. And we've heard every lineman that comes to Miami or any other Shanahan-type team talking about how they do things differently. They're running off the ball, right? They're trying to it's a different mentality of playing. So, I think that was part of the developmental struggle with Jonah, was switching sides and adjusting to doing that. Caden Proctor staying on the same side, but still has to adjust to doing that. Whereas DJ Campbell, right, he may come in and hit the ground running a little quicker. I think the big thing for him is going to come down to versatility, right? Because we know that Caden Proctor is the left guard. Jonah seems like he is likely the right guard here. And then Aaron Brewer's obviously the starting center. So Campbell, I think, is going to have to be able to show that versatility. You talked about him starting so much on the right side. He's going to need to be able to show that he can play on the left side as well. And then, we've heard both John Eric Sullivan and Jeff Hafley talk about the importance of linemen being able to play multiple positions. And we saw reports that, they were going to work DJ Campbell at center a little bit as well. So I think that it's going to be interesting to see how he develops through camp and to see how he plays on both sides and if he can develop into a competent center as well.
Yeah. He was one of the most durable and experienced guards in the draft class, right? He faced Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant in the Cheez-It Citrus Bowl New Year's Eve in 2025. Actual first-round defensive tackles, in a pretty big bowl game, right? And John Eric Sullivan, he praised his steady improvements that he made throughout, his 3 starting years at Texas. It's documented on tape, right? When you talk about just his scheme fit into Bobby Slowick's offense, that Shanahan-style system, he can fit into those outside zone. He has the long arms, which he can trap and snatch second-level defenders, but also it kind of also allows Bobby Slowick to differentiate a little bit, where there can also be vertical run concepts as well, where there's a little bit of gap scheme as well. Okay, because Texas, not only did they also run wide zone, but they also ran gap as well. And when you talk about gap schemes, coach, you're literally moving the player. You're displacing the player instead of moving either to the left or to the right side and getting up to the second level. He's not doing no combo blocks on those gap concepts. He's not going to help out Austin Jackson if he's, on the right side. He's going to be one-on-one against his man, and he's going to disrupt the defensive line. He's got power in his legs, and his body. He's got a steady core base where he can generate that drive as a run blocker. He has that strength. He can stay engaged. He finishes those blocks, and he's a nasty, nasty guy that can run his feet throughout the whistle.
Yeah, I agree completely. Like, when you talk about the build of interior offensive linemen, right, you look at, it's tough to look at a player, basically the silhouette, and be able to judge a player off of that, right? But when you look at a Liam Eichenberg, a Cole Strange, those type of players, you can see that narrow lower half, and you see that show up on film as well, the way that they struggle against those first level, right? The big defensive tackles. Whereas DJ Campbell, right, even though he may be similar size overall, that weight distribution is a bit different, where he is very thick in the lower half, and that shows up in his ability with his leg drive. Again, I think the biggest thing is that, similar to a Will Kacmarek, you kind of know exactly what you're getting with a DJ Campbell, right? We've talked about other guys in Traore, Kyle Lewis, Trey Moore. Like, we're talking about them trying to change positions in some cases or learn football. Like, DJ Campbell has played a ton of football, has a ton of film out there against SEC level competition. And we've heard John Eric Sullivan talk about when you're, drafting, especially deep here in day 3, that you're either looking for those guys that just have that solid, consistent film or have those physical attributes that you can develop. I think that DJ Campbell, while he does have solid physical attributes, right? I think this is just again, you know exactly what you're getting when you put him in the lineup. I think there's not a huge ceiling here, but we're also talking about a pretty high floor here with him. It's not right. He's played, like you said, right? Mason Graham. He has played against the best competition that college football has to offer, and he's been able to hold up and hold on to that position in a very good offensive line school in Texas. So yeah, I think again, versatility is going to be key in terms of where he slots in on the 53. But whenever he does get on the field, I feel like this is a player that you can be confident is going to be at least solid.
Yeah, he's going to be depth behind Caden Proctor and Jonas Avenai. He's going to be competing for that backup interior offensive lineman role, potentially a starter, maybe in 2 to 3 years, either at center or right guard, depending on what happens with Jonas Avenai. But we talked a lot of good about Caden, about DJ Campbell, right? We haven't really talked about what he lacks at, and which is pass protection up against those speed rushers to the outside, right? Although his feet are really good at driving forward, it's not the best as going backward because he can't necessarily redirect. When you're talking as a guard, going up against a speed rusher and they're coming from the outside, right? His feet are a little bit slow to react. His weight is already committed outside, and he can't really adjust his weight to move a little bit inside, gain that backtrack, and make sure that the pocket is protected. Doesn't necessarily have that quick footedness or that speed that you need for him to move back, right? He, along with his weight and his foot speed, it kind of limits his ability to redirect and mirror in isolation because NFL defensive tackles are going to do that, and they're just going to spam that all day long against him. We saw it up against Cole Strange. We saw it up against Liam Eichenberg, where DJ Campbell, he has a little bit more, width in his body compared to Strange and Liam Campbell. That width can help, in certain situations, but not all the time. And he's going to have to develop that speed. He's going to have to develop that quickness. And that's where the outside zone pass scheme also comes into play, where it's not a pure drop back type of passing game, which it was a little bit at Texas, where they had some dropbacks and then they had a lot of RPOs. In the NFL, you'll have some dropbacks, you'll have play action, and from the looks of it looks like the Dolphins offense is going to run the ball, a ton this season, and he's going to have to learn in preseason in that play action game and the pure dropback sets too.
Yeah, and I think that you can hide some of that stuff in your play calls, right? We saw the Dolphins do that in the past with Tua and the quick release with Malik Willis and his ability to roll out. Like, I think that you're going to be able to cover some of that. And you're right. Like the foot quickness, it's an issue that you may not think would show up, right? Because we talk about him being good in outside zone, but a lot of that is essentially linear type speed and explosion, right? You're running for the most part, in a straight line using the defense's momentum against him. Whereas in pass protection, right, you've got to be able to get that change of direction. So I think that, when he gets going in a straight line, right, and way off topic type comparison here, right, but Mike Gesicki, for example, great linear speed, but if you asked him to change direction, then it was going to take him about 3 days to get there, right? And DJ Campbell's kind of the same way in the sense that exploding off the ball, running to his target in outside zone, he can be effective in that. But if you start getting stunts in there where he has to plant his foot and be able to turn, then that can be where that shows up. And same deal there in pass protection. We saw teams do it against Jonas Avenai last year, where you would overload the other side and essentially get him one-on-one with a tackle on his side, and then you could make him work in space they didn't want to be in. And that's going to be the same thing with DJ Campbell. Like I said, I think that if you get him in the lineup, you know what you're getting. I think you're getting a solid level player, but you're also getting a player that, he's not completely, I don't want to say he's not scheme versatile, because he can play in different schemes, but he's not a player that you can just plug in there and just say, we're going to call things exactly the way that we have and expect the same results. You are going to have to cover him up at times.
Yeah. All right. Last guy that the Dolphins drafted, Max Llewellyn, pick number 238 in the 7th round, acquired via trade with the New York Jets. And he was born and raised in Iowa, went to Iowa, right? He's through and through a hometown guy. 4 years at Iowa, walked the line of patience, 43 career games, and he didn't become a full-time starter until his 5th year. He was a redshirt from 2021 to 2023. 2024, he had 5.5 sacks, 8 tackles for loss. And, he was more so of a rotational guy. In 2025, when he finally became a full-time starter, he played in all 13 games, 26 tackles, 9.5 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, 6 passes defended, and 2 forced fumbles, and was an all Big Ten honorable mention. And the big thing with him is his spin move, Coach. Right? He led the entire country in pressures on spin move rushes over the last 2 seasons. He had 27 spin move wins, resulting in 27 pressures alone. 45 quarterback pressures, 11th highest pressure rate in the Big Ten at almost 15%. Just looking at his size, 6'6", 258, 14.5 career sacks, almost 15% pressure rate. Just his athletic profile reminds me of Rashawn Gary coming out of Michigan. Now, Rashawn Gary, he's 6'5", 275 pounds. Llewellyn is 6'6", 258. He can gain maybe 5, 10 more pounds of muscle mass in training camp to get up to 268, maybe 270, and really be that heavyweight, pure pass rusher that Miami has lacked.
Yeah, this is very much a one-trick pony type player, and I'm going to invoke a name here that's going to make some Dolphins fans grumble, but like Charles Harris coming out of Missouri was similar in that sense, right? He also had a devastating spin move, but that was about all he had. The difference here is that we drafted Charles Harris, like number 12 overall? He was
First round, yeah.
first round pick, and we're drafting Llewellyn in the 7th round, right? So that's where you can take this guy who has that one really standout attribute and see if you can develop the stuff around it, right? He's not going to be able to win just on the spin move in the NFL, right? Going against better competition. Not that it was bad competition that he was against the Big Ten, but NFL tackles are going to catch on to that quickly. He's going to have to develop different, some counter moves, some different ways to set up that speed move, learn to pass rush with a little more power, and then he's going to have to hold up in the run game a little better than what he did as well. And we have seen Chop Robinson talking recently, and coaches talking about him over the last couple of days, that Chop Robinson's in that same development, right? Trying to get better at defending the run, talking about how his eyes are a big thing there. And now that the defensive ends are working with the defensive tackles, and you have Austin Clark working with them. So this is, right, one of those, essentially a ball of clay that Austin Clark can work with, and see if we can, mold him into something that can be serviceable, right? This is a 7th round pick. We're not coming in and expecting him to be a 10 sack guy by any means. We've said it over and over again, especially today's show where we're talking about these late day 3 guys, right? Special teams is going to be his path onto the roster. He needs to be able to be a core 4 special teams guy that gets a couple opportunities to pass rush in the game, but he's not good enough as a pass rusher to just be that, right? So this is another one that you're going to have to see him improve through training camp and show that he can do more than just a spin move.
Yeah. And the thing is, too, when that spin move isn't working, and when he knows it's not working, he gets his hands up just to, bat passes at the line of scrimmage when he knows he's not winning that rush. And just that production, even on his negative reps, is actually a positive, right? He's able to create different types of opportunities inside the pocket where he's not putting pressure on the quarterback, right? When you watch a little bit of his film, right, he's got a really good motor. He chases the play to the end until the final whistle, never really quits on the rep. Whereas compared to Charles Harris, sometimes, he would quit. And then if you think about it, and coach, it leads me to believe, which is with his size, and if he gains a little bit more muscle, uh, wouldn't you think Austin Clark could potentially move him inside in some snaps for more so of a speedier, second down, second and long package, or third and long package, just trying to get after the quarterback, right? Because if you think about it, even on rundowns, look, he's not the best run defender. He doesn't have the strength to set the edge up against bigger, powerful offensive tackles, but you put him up against guards, right? We talked about a guy like a DJ Campbell, a 6th-round draft pick. Maybe they want to attack, a 5th or 6th-round guard, up against the Jets or the Patriots or whoever else it is. 32% of Llewellyn's career tackles resulted in a loss, right? He's not just attempting to make tackles, he's making them, and he's making others pay for trying to get at him, right? He waited 5 years. He was very patient for his opportunity. And, I think with a guy like him, with this opportunity he'll have, as a 7th-round rookie, just that hunger, that drive, he'll want to create any opportunities, take any opportunities, and make sure he wins those opportunities.
Yeah, these are always fun conversations when we sit here, you and I, just kind of talking about where they can fit in and how they can find their way to get in between the lines on the field. You talked about his relentless pursuit, and that's always going to track well in the NFL, right? Especially right special teams guys. We've seen those clips of the special teams guy that goes down, misses a tackle, gets up, chases it 20 yards downfield, and forces a fumble. That's the type of thing that you can get when you do that. Same thing with the pass rush, right? If you don't get there, but you have other guys that are, flushing a quarterback out, and you're not just giving up on the rep and just standing there with your offensive lineman, then you can create other opportunities. And I really like what you're talking about there with the idea of, maybe adding a little bit of muscle to him and moving him to the inside. Because like I said, I don't think that spin move is going to be as effective against NFL offensive tackles, right? But if we're talking alignment, schematic, stuff like that, right? Think about Chop Robinson out there as that wide 9 type player, right? And we shift everything else to the other side, and we put that guard on an island against Llewellyn. If he can get better at setting up that spin move, then like you said, you get him against a DJ Campbell, a Jonas Vainaya, those type of guys that struggle in space as a guard. That's where that spin move can continue to be effective in the NFL, where, if you just leave him on the edge, Patrick Paul's just going to bear hug him, wrap him up, and the rep's going to be over. But you get him against a guard that can't get his hands on him as quick and doesn't have the foot speed, then that, again, very situationally moving him to the inside, you can create an opportunity. And it might be, a 4 to 5 snap opportunity in a season that you get to put him in those, right? But 4 to 5 sacks in a year can make a huge difference.
Yeah. When we talk about, he talked about his player comp like a Charles Harris, right? Just in his pass rush game. Llewellyn is not as technically refined, but his athletic profile, his size, his spin move up against, offensive tackles, what he could potentially do up against guards if he moves inside. Well, I read about a comp of Llewellyn where you could compare him a little bit to Sam Hubbard. He played with the Cincinnati Bengals, 3rd-round pick out of Ohio State in 2017, 2018, something like that. He waited his turn at Ohio State, also waited with the Cincinnati Bengals, and, made the most of his opportunities. And he could do the same thing where Llewellyn, he's definitely going to have to wait his turn. He's going to have to earn his role, and he has to maximize his moment. He did that at Iowa. I think, John Eric Sullivan and Jeff Halfley are betting the same story happens in Miami.
Yeah, I agree. Right. Again, right. Special teams, get out there, work your butt off, make some plays. Maybe maybe go to a Pro Bowl as a special teams player. Right. And that's the kind of stuff that you do that can earn you snaps on the defensive side as well. And Sam Hubbard, I think, is a really good name to bring up there because that's a player that, is never going to be the star of a defense. But when you talk about a high effort guy that kind of fills a role and can, is not a liability out there, that's the same type of thing that you essentially aspire for Max Llewellyn to be. Because Max, he's never, right, he's not going to be, we just saw Myles Garrett get traded, right? We're not anywhere close to that. That's never going to be the way that we talk about him. But if you can see him contribute as a core special teams player in his first and second years, and then you're getting into his third year, he starts to gain a few more defensive snaps, and then you get towards the end of that rookie contract, and that's where you kind of see, is he ready to be not a full-time player, but a majority snap player on defense? And then you kind of establish a second contract based on that, and that's, as you get into years 4 and 5, right, that's where he could possibly become an important part of the defense that may be a little underappreciated.
Yeah. Talking about 13 NFL draft prospects for a team coach. This was probably one of our more lengthier series for sure within the last 2 years on this podcast. I will say we put a lot of effort, a lot of research, a lot of film into this as well. And 13 picks, man, that's a lot for sure. And, hopefully they can get at least 5-6 solid starter contributors out of this draft class for sure. I mean, you talk about, Caden Proctor, Chris Johnson, who are likely going to be starters, right? A guy like Caleb Douglas, who Miami Herald is reporting could be that slot receiver type of guy who can help block in the run game. Will Kastmerick as that, second tight end in 12 personnel, 13 personnel, your traditional wide tight end, maybe your force player that plays, maybe 30, 40 snaps a game alongside Greg Dulcich. Then you also have Chris Bell, who could be potentially coming off an injury later on in the season to contribute. And then you can't forget about Jacob Rodriguez either, Coach.
Yeah, I mean, there's, like you said, 13 picks. I've had a lot of fun going through all of these guys. Like you said, it's been one of the most exhaustive, right, the series that we've done. I hope that this is the last time for a while the Dolphins have 13 picks. It was a lot easier to do these when they only had 5-6 picks. But I do think that, like you said, they're not all going to pan out. We'd like to sit here and think that they all have a role on the 53, that they're all going to get second contracts. That's just not reality, right? Probably some of these guys that were picked in days 1 and 2 are not going to pan out. But I think that when you're talking about the first draft for John Eric Sullivan and Jeff Hafley, having this number of picks casts a wider net, right? I think that if you hit basically 50% in the NFL draft, you're going to be a pretty good GM in the NFL. So when you talk about 50% of the Dolphins NFL draft, you're talking about 6 to 7 players. And if you can hit even close to that rate, right, nobody cares if you made 13 picks. If you've got 7 guys that pan out, there's no way that you can say that that's a bad draft, right? So I think that I like the strategy for this season. Hope it's not necessarily the strategy going forward
into next season. Yeah.
Let's try to keep it in the single digits next season.
Yeah, so that way we don't have to do an exhaustive draft process where we do maybe 15 players next time or 10 players next time for sure. All right, stick with us here on Scouting the Fins, part of the 3 Yards Per Carry podcast feed, also part of the 5 Reasons Sports Network. As always, y'all, fins up.